On the occasion of the World Environment Day, and aligned with the school's mission and vision, where planetary well-being is one of our strategic axes, we are interviewing the writer and literature professor at the University of Edinburgh, David Farrier. He's the author of Footprints, a book that invites us to think about how we will be remembered in the myths, stories, and languages of future generations. Because tomorrow, our planet will be colonized by our current activity through the transformation of ecosystems, the exploitation of natural resources, and the generation of long-term waste. He will be interviewed by Quevedo, an international award-winning Spanish producer, presenter, and entrepreneur, and journalist with a background in sciences and alumnus from UPF-Barcelona School of Management.
David, I'm kind of tempted to say that your book is kind of an ode to deep time. Isn't it? So what is deep time for you?
Yeah, thanks. It's deep time is really, it refers to the age of the Earth. Deep time invites us to think about timescales that unfold in geological time. It's way beyond the experience of anyone living, or even indeed in some respects human imagination. Deep time asks us to think about time on the scale of the planet itself.
Right. Do you think we are capable of doing that on a day-to-day basis? Meaning, one thing is to write a book, a beautiful book such as this one, but can we incorporate that vision into our, Monday through Sunday lives?
It's a challenge, yes, but I think we can. I think it's possible to stretch our imagination and in doing so stretch our sense of empathy as well. The reason that I think it's so important to think in terms of deep time as well as in terms of the time that we experience is because so much of what we're doing today in the present is going to have an effect on the world to come for not just thousands of years but thousands of generations to come. We are shaping the world that those who follow us, that our descendants will have to live in. And so I think that requires us to not just be able to imagine that kind of impact on those lives that are so distant to ours, but to feel a sense of connection, to feel an empathy for those people who will have to cope with a world that we make that may be very challenging, that may present radically different ecosystems to the ones that humans have known for all of human history. So yeah, I think we can, but I also think we must.
You set out to search that beautiful concept of the future fossils today. Tell me, I don't know, the three that you enjoyed the most, the three that surprised you the most. What pearls did you find in that search?
I found incredible things, things that astonished me, certainly. I set out to find out what traces we're going to leave for the deep future, for people who come after us to find, and what that might tell them about how we lived. And the future fossil is a kind of conceit, really. It's a way of making that very distant future immediate and available in the present, because anything could be a future fossil. The laptop that I'm talking to you on now, that in the right conditions, that could create its own kind of future fossil. The thing about future fossils is they are the things that surround us every day. They're the cities we live in. They're the everyday objects around our home, or the things the glasses that I'm wearing, the mobile phone in my pocket. And so that was one of the most surprising things I think about future fossils, was realizing that they are quite ordinary. They're things that we take for granted. A plastic bottle, something that we might only use once and then discard, actually has a long life that will extend far beyond the moment when we use it. One of the most astonishing future fossils, though, that I discovered and thought about was Shanghai. I was really interested to find out what might happen to a mega city like Shanghai, one of the biggest cities there's ever been in the deep future, and how it might become a fossil. And the story was quite remarkable, thinking about how all the various materials, the concrete, the glass, the steel, might change over very deep time, how it might leave its own kind of fossil trace in the strata, in the rock record. And the thought that there might even be very precise outlines of things we take for granted, like bicycle wheels or chopsticks, left, that would tell stories about who we were and how we lived. And I think, of all the future fossils that I've encountered, it's cities that will tell the most detailed, eloquent story about life in the 21st century, whether it's in terms of the kind of buildings that we lived in, our capacity to move materials across the world.
Right.
That it tells us, any city tells a story of global connection, how we moved.
Right.
They might even tell really interesting, detailed stories about how we live day to day. If an item of clothing were to fossilize, or a watch, or as I said, a laptop, they'll all tell things about
Right.
how we occupied ourselves, the tools we used. So yeah, it was these most ordinary aspects of everyday life that struck me most about the kind of future fossils that we'll leave.
David, you're mentioning there's a time compression effect here, because as I was reading, I was thinking, well, bacteria poisoned the air of the whole planet and changed life forever. Algae built gigatons of limestone, right, with which we build buildings today. But all that took eons, took an enormous amount of time. All what you're referring to, it's basically, what, 100 years? It's astonishing.
Yeah, there has been a massive acceleration in all kinds of planetary processes driven by human activity since certainly since 1950. You could even trace
Yeah.
it back 100 years earlier, to the onset of the Industrial Revolution. But since the end of the Second World War and the great acceleration, this boom in productivity and consumption, we've massively accelerated all kinds of processes. The carbon cycle, pumping huge quantities of carbon into the atmosphere. We've accelerated the rate of melting in the Arctic,
Right.
and there's a lot of uncertainty about how rapid that is. How the so-called Doomsday Glacier in West Antarctica, Thwaites Glacier, that is a kind of a capstone holding back the mass of the West Antarctic ice sheet. No, it's melting. No one knows quite how quickly. And so, we know that these processes are accelerating and they'll have huge implications for us, but we don't know quite how fast and over what timescale. One of the things that startled me most in writing Footprints was a study produced by the Australian National University that calculated that we would see 10,000 years of ecological change in 58 years, which is less than the average human lifespan.
It's mind-blowing.
Which is astonishing, I think,
Right.
and sobering.
Do you think, because that figure, it's amazing. So 58 years, so nothing, absolutely nothing in geological terms. But will it be sufficient for us to realize that change? Because another concept in ecology and climate change, this idea of shifting baselines, right? That my grandfather experienced a nature quite different from my father and extremely different from me, but we don't realize those 50-year changes. Do you think we can grasp that change?
I think we've been taught not to.
Also.
We've been taught not to think in these terms, certainly, by being, we're taught to think short term. We're taught to think in terms of election cycles or in terms of satisfying the most immediate consumer impulse, and so on. We're not really asked to think in terms of intergenerational time, where we need to cultivate a more time-minded sense, I think. We need to become more time-minded and alert to the rapidity of change, and the long duration of the changes that we're making. It's a challenge because so much of contemporary society is organized to work against that, to keep us focused on the present. But we are I think one of the most important lessons of the climate crisis is that we are more than our present. We also are having massive impacts that will won't fully come to pass and have their greatest effect for generations to come in some cases. If we think about sea level rise, we talk about perhaps seeing as much as a meter of sea level rise by the end of this century. But that kind of gives the impression that at that point it will stop, which is not true. The seas are going to continue to rise for centuries afterwards. What we can do now is think, well, what can we do to arrest that change, to make sure that sea level rise is as slow and as limited as we can make it?
You say, part of what you're saying reminds me of do you know the Long Now Foundation? And so there's a really, I think sometimes revolutionary idea about not having this conversation in 2021, but in 2021, forcing us to frame our lives and our reality differently. Do we need more tools such as those one?
I really like that tool. Yeah, that idea of putting an extra zero at the front of the year, just to expand our sense of the time we live in. I think that can be really effective, because it's an everyday thing. It puts us in our present moment, but also in a larger sense of time. I'm skeptical, I have to say, about other aspects of the Long Now Foundation's work.
The
clock of the Long
everything
Now.
else.
So the Amazon funded clock in the mountain that will keep time for 10,000 years. I worry that is a slightly detached, standardized, approach to deep time, almost as if it could be standardized in the same way as an item in an Amazon warehouse.
I was thinking perhaps it's completely unnecessary. You open your book with beautiful scenes of those kind of clocks. Watching geological features, if one's eyes are slightly trained, one can see that deep time right in front of our faces, right?
Yeah. Well, I think it's appreciating that everything around us has a story and is telling a story that can reach back into the deep past and the deep future. We are so focused on our present, and understandably so, not least in the midst of a global pandemic. But nonetheless, almost anything that you can think of has a deep time dimension to it. But what we need to concern ourselves with is the way in which it's our actions that are also reaching into deep time as well, I think. And so, I think we can cultivate that.
I was thinking your book has something, a virtue, which is it not only encompasses the science, which tends to be, we're used to it being rather dry, with amazing literary effort, and it's a beautiful book that nevertheless conveys the science, which is, and my question is, do you think there's a role for the arts in this conversation and this global change that we are not using to its full capacity?
That's very kind of you. Thank you for saying that. I think the arts absolutely have a vital role to play. And it comes down to, again, this idea of stories. The idea that carried me through Footprints was that the future fossils that we are creating, that we are surrounded by, they're all stories told to the future, potentially. Even if 1% of the mobile phones on the planet survives and the rest are dissipate and no traces left, that still is a huge quantity of materials and traces. And it could be any mobile phone that leaves a trace. So anything has the potential to tell a story to the deep future. Every single molecule of carbon in the atmosphere that we've placed there, every single particle of microplastic is a story told to the future about what we cared about and about what we didn't care about. And so that's what I think the role of stories is. It can remind us that we're always communicating with the generations that are to follow us. We're always engaged with them in that sense. And I think what art can help us to do is what art can help us to do is to not just sort of see the world as it is now, but imagine the world as it could be. Imagine the world otherwise.
David, do you think there's a sort of a moral dimension to deep time? Meaning, when one thinks in tens of thousands or millions of years, everything seems to be rather not only zoomed out, right, but amoral, right? Like there's nothing that really matters that much. How can we use it to a moral end, which is address our current crisis?
No, so, yeah, thank you. It's a really important question, and of course, there is a chilly, detached element to deep time. You know, it's often said, you hear it said that we need to save the planet, and that's always, I think, a slight misunderstanding. The planet doesn't care,
Yeah,
really, and the
fine.
planet will go on regardless of what human societies do. What we need to preserve is a livable planet, a planet on which life can thrive. And that applies to, you know, our children, our grandchildren, and great grandchildren as much as it does to generations that won't be born for 10,000 or 100,000 years. Um, you know, if we are minded to ensure that the planet, you know, as much as we can now, remains a place for life to thrive for those who won't be born in 10,000 years, that is only going to be a good thing for our children, for our grandchildren. You know, I don't see these things as distant. If we cultivate the attitude of being the best ancestors that we can be, then we do good not just for the people who are so far away from us that we can't even imagine what their lives will be like, as we do for the people who are most important to us.
Right. One final idea that at least your book got into my mind, which is probably one of the pressing problems that we have, is that we are trying to answer the climate crisis with science, and science is by definition amoral. It is just science. It's the better facts that we can find, those we can agree upon. It is the arts where we can have moral, human. I guess the discussion is to be had here in the literature, not in the science. Wouldn't you agree?
I think we need communication between the two, and that's happening. I mean, I think what we've seen in recent years is not just a kind of a burgeoning of public understanding of the climate crisis, but more and more climate scientists willing to step forward and say, this is happening, you know, to kind of leave aside that objectivity that is so essential to the training in science, and to say, no, we need to act. There, as you said, there is a moral dimension to this. You know, the number of scientists who now are stepping forward in the media and saying, you know, I feel grief at what I'm witnessing and what I've dedicated my life to studying. So that, I think, has been a really important change, and it shows us that the arts and the sciences can perhaps come close together to tell a fuller story about, you know, the way in which we are, you know, making the world in our own image, if I can put it like that. You know, where so much of the planet now kind of wears the, you know, the traces of our touch and our activity, you know, reflects our image back to us. Science can tell us a great deal about that. It can give us the numbers, but I think the arts can give us the stories and the images to help us imagine otherwise, to imagine a more hopeful way forward, perhaps.
You say in your book that we should aim only at taking photographs and leave only footprints. um, do, do you think we will be able to do that at a planetary level?
That's the cliche, isn't it? And I think, I mean, no, the notion of a kind of pristine nature is a fallacy, of course. I mean, we can't return to any kind of ideal state. Nature is always dynamic, it's always in flux. And I think we have to be careful of not fetishizing a certain idea of untouched, unspoiled nature. But what we do have to decide is what kind of, you know, we have to be aware of the kind of impacts we're having, acknowledge them, and do so in a considered way, so that we minimize the most damaging, and we do what we can, as I said, to nurture a thriving ecosystem. the whole notion of the carbon footprint is a deeply suspect one. I think, its origins are in, British Petroleum's rebranding of itself several decades ago, and trying to shift responsibility from the corporation onto the individual. I think we need to be careful about that.
Yes. David, thank you so very much. It's been great.
Thank you, Luis.